Okay. All right, well, we'll wait a couple of minutes and see if anyone else joins us.
Hi, everybody.
Joni's over here.
Hi,
Hi,
Joni.
Johnny.
Hi.
She's off camera. How you guys all doing? You feeling all right?
It's nice that it's a little warmer today.
What, you're complaining about how cold it was? And what, it got down into the 50s?
I know. But it's so uncomfortable compared to, I know when I'm in Denver and it's in the 50s, it's just gorgeous. You go outside, you don't even need a jacket or anything. But I mean, not that I've been wearing jackets, but it just feels so different without the humidity and dampness.
Yeah, it's really beautiful. I've been having my top down and put on a sweater and 3 layers, t-shirt. Got kids.
I don't see many convertibles. I don't see those these days.
Really? They just
Yeah.
don't put the top down, but their convertibles are out there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fran puts hers down as often as she can.
Yeah,
Oh,
me too. I actually keep it down even in the hot weather. There's a breeze when you're on the freeway or driving, and I don't know. I find it very refreshing to have the fresh air, whatever it is.
I miss
Fran
mom.
won't drive on the freeway with it.
Welcome, Alice.
Thank you.
Okay, we're gonna.
How many people do you expect?
Oh, I have no idea.
oh.
I have no idea.
Hmm.
I didn't actually get a list from of who signed up, and I mean, it hasn't been well publicized. It was in the February email, wasn't in the bulletin.
Right.
So, we're recording it, and those who want to watch will. So, I guess we'll begin. Since you guys are on time, I don't want to penalize you for it. So why don't we do the blessing for Torah study, since we're going to study some text. Baruch
Baruch
atah
atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam
asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav
atah v'tzivanu
la'asok b'divrei Torah. So, and you all know what that means. La'asok is to do business, to busy ourselves, right? To be involved in the way you do with business. You get involved in the weeds of it, b'divrei, in matters of Torah. So we're going to be looking in this class, we've been looking at Midrash through the eyes of the women who created Dir Shuni. Though tonight, we're also, if we get to it, I hope we will, we'll get as well to a male's take on the way Dir Shuni has evolved modern Midrash, and a male's reflecting on what those women have done through a modern approach toward looking at Gaza, and the whole idea of Gaza. There have been a few things written and are being written after October 7th to reflect the situation in the Jewish world, because Midrash in the ancient world, going back 1,500 years, 1,800 years, when Midrash was being written, actually related to that world. They were making statements on their world. They were making statements on the Greco-Roman world, the world of Zoroastrianism, of Persian society and culture, Babylonian culture. And Midrash was one of the ways they did that. They probed the text, the Hebrew, the Tanakh, but they were also doing it with an eye toward lessons that would help them deal with the world they found. So that was a vehicle. That was before there were really what we call drashot or sermons. It was really before formal commentary. Commentary evolved later. But Midrash was their way of explaining the text for them in their contemporaneous world. And so that's in effect what the Dirshuni women are doing and have been doing since the end of the last century, began publishing in 2003 and have continued to publish and to write Midrashim. And now males have started up again following the women. Okay, so I want to start with a question to you. This is your time to comment. So you can either raise your hand or raise your digital hand so we don't talk over each other. So my first question is, what do you remember of Seders, your Seders, when you were young, when you were growing up? What do you remember about them? What comes to mind? How do you describe them? Who would like to begin? You all have memories about them. Yes, Alice.
Well, when I was young, my parents always had the entire family, my father's side, over. And I remember when my cousins were born, they were like 2 years old, and they were sitting at the Seder singing, "Die, die, Heinu, die, die, Heinu." And those are the ones that aren't Jewish. But they always, even after my parents moved to California and we moved to Florida, my cousin, who was brought up with both religions of Methodist and Jewish, made her own Seders and invited her church and a bunch of people. And it was really wonderful.
Okay.
And now
Alice, who led the Seders?
my father.
Okay, and where was your mother during the Seder?
At the other end of the table.
And who was in the kitchen? How did that happen?
I think we usually had someone serving.
Oh, okay, so you had a helper. All
Yeah.
right, got it. Who else?
But then we all
to...
did the dishes, so.
Right. Who else would like to? Right. Who else would like to have memories of what went on?
I have great memories about our Seders. We always had the first night was at actually the two families, our family and my father's partner's family, who was an uncle. They were partners in business, and they both conducted the Seders, mainly going around. They did all the Hebrew. My uncle happened to be the cantor. I'm not a formal cantor, but he was the cantor at the shul. I was in a small town, remember? And so we had a lot of music. He was really great. And Daddy brought, even though he really couldn't carry a tune very well, but he brought all the melodies from the old country, shall we say. And we really had an old-fashioned Seder. And in the Maxwell House Coffee Agada. And they were really great. They really were wonderful.
Where were the mothers?
Actually, mainly in the kitchen.
Right. And who else would like to describe their Seders? Yeah, Gail.
Mine, I don't really have great memories of when I was young at a Seder. I think it was just a lot of New Yorkers came down from our families, and we all had dinner together. You know, we knew they were all coming in, and that was the celebration. And using some of the Maxwell House, you know, book, but nothing that I actually remember. But I do have vivid memories of Seders with Uncle Al and Kay Ossip. And JD was just an infant sitting in his little high chair. And their girls went to the Hebrew Academy. We didn't leave any song out. We didn't leave anything out. They participated fully. We had Odessa, who was helping serve and everything, but they were very special. And then later on, Eddie took over, and we always had a large number of not only just our family, but in-laws from other people, friends of mine, friends of Eddie's, and it was always Freilach, and I usually try to include a Holocaust survivor that I'd been on the march with, and we gave them an opportunity to speak about some of their memories. So
Okay,
I remember those so well.
good. Joni wants to chime in here, nice and loud.
My dad led the Seder. It was very small. It was just our immediate family and my dad's cousin. And he would lead it totally in Hebrew and just really fast, never really understood anything. Since I was the youngest, he transliterated the Manishtana for me. And I just, you know, read the transliteration. I had no idea what was going on. I had no idea about the meaning of it or anything. And my mother was in the kitchen, even though there were just, you know, 5 of us at the table, she was in the kitchen.
Okay, and Adele, you want to, or Rachel? You want to share?
I do. I have very fond memories of Seder's. It was always led at a great uncle of mine, my Uncle Dave, and Aunt Data. My Aunt Data was the sister of my Nana, who also had 2 brothers, and they lived in Brooklyn, who used to come out to the show. My mom was one of 4 sisters, the oldest. So I was really at that time the only I was the only child that was there, except for 2 cousins of mine from one of the uncles, great uncles. And we always had other guests come. And it was, I don't know, probably 30 plus people all the time. Always, you know, 2 nights. It lasted till well after midnight. And everyone participated. My uncle would always ask questions. We had to answer. And it was, you know, similar questions every year. Food was always delicious. My Aunt Ada had help, so that's who was in the kitchen. My Uncle Dave was a doctor. One of my fondest, well, I guess many times I was the one who found the Afikomen because I was the youngest, and I always asked for books. So I expected to get 1 book, but one year, I guess I must have been in 2nd grade, I don't know. I got an entire book of Nancy Drew, a series, like 25 up at the house. And I was so overwhelmed because that was such a fabulous gift. But yes, it's so nice to say this X amount of years later, I still have wonderful, wonderful fond memories of Seder's, and it's still a special time of year as far as I'm concerned.
And Adele, would you like to?
So I remember great warmth. I remember my mother used to love to invite people over. Our Seders had always a number of people who were not in our family. And they might be her friends or they might be my friends. And both my mother and my father were in and out of the kitchen because my father's task was to deal with the turkey. And that was quite a task. And everybody else
cleared the table and brought the food out, and it was pretty trafficky.
Who led the
And
Seder, Adele?
my father,
Uh-huh, right. So
and
what,
it wasn't
oh,
complete, but it wasn't Seder light either. It was sort of in the middle.
sort of a dinner, sort of a Seder, right? So, I mean, when I was young, it was at my grandparents'. They were both from Eastern Europe, immigrants. My grandpa led it. My grandma only came out of the kitchen to serve the food. My aunts were in there with her. They kept peeking out to see where my grandpa was in the service. So when it was time to wash hands, the bowls came out. The women basically were in there. That's where they were, and the men were around the table, and it was sort of like Joni's. It was kind of davened. The Seder was kind of davened. But what I want to just point out is, so we are all old enough to have experienced a massive change in Judaism. Massive change. A change that didn't take place basically since biblical days. In biblical days, women mattered beyond kitchen, beyond food, beyond hospitality. If you look at the biblical the figures, they had roles to play beyond just taking care of the house. You have figures like Deborah, who actually directed a war, right? You have figures like Bathsheba, who helped Solomon become the king. You have figures like Sarah, who made it very clear that she could direct the servants of the household and throw them out when she wanted to. You have figures like Rebecca, who actually found a way to choose between her two sons who would succeed the head of the tribe. When you get to the Talmudic period, women almost disappear except as a subject. They're a subject. In the Mishnah, they are one of the 6 books. It's called Nashim, women. So you have sacrifices, you have festivals, you have women. It's a subject. They play almost no role except as subjects. They're talked about, but they are not talking. There's no voice. Women had voices in the Tanakh, but they lost their voices after that period in diaspora. You understand that? And that we have lived in the last basically 60 years or 70 years, really since World War II, with the period when women have reclaimed a voice and are continuing to reclaim a voice. You should never discount what we've experienced. This is cataclysmic, and it has accounted for many of the changes that we have seen, not just in the Jewish world, but in the world at large. After World War II, when women were empowered to take jobs that were not typical women's jobs, when the men were gone, many of them, we sent millions of soldiers, almost exclusively men, I mean. Very few women went to our war, except as support. They were not in the battles. So we sent millions of soldiers, pulled them out of the economy, and our women during World War II began to take jobs that traditionally were never allowed to women. They were never open. Factory jobs, farming jobs, beyond just running the farm as a homemaker, but jobs where they had to go out and physically be involved in the work. And they proved themselves more than capable of dealing with life beyond the home. And when the war was over and the men came back and women were kicked out of their jobs and displaced by the men, because after all, men are the breadwinners, That's what it was. And you have to give the man the job. The woman doesn't need it as much. The women were no longer satisfied. And they fought to get back in. They fought by education. They began to be educated in larger numbers. They fought to prove themselves worthy of competing with men. And we saw this massive change. And it's continuing. That change is not done. That also was the precursor to the civil rights movement. World War II also showed that African Americans could fight along with any other ethnic group and fight well. They came back, they were not satisfied with taking their old position. They began fighting for their rights. Eventually, as all this developed, gays and lesbians began to fight for their rights. We've seen all of this as an outcome to the massive disruption, I would argue, of of World War II. I don't think it was just World War II. There were a lot of precursors to World War II, but that was the massive disruptor. It disrupted our society in many ways. And when we came back together, we were no longer willing, all of us, to play the old roles. So what started to happen in Judaism as well is women began saying, why shouldn't we be leaders at the Seder, or leaders in the synagogue, or leaders as educators, or leaders in every role within Judaism? And women started pushing. Now, it took a few decades. It didn't take as long as we think, because the first woman was ordained in 1972.
72.
Right? 1972. The war ended in 45. So you think about Sally was the child of the women, a woman and the women and men who went through World War II, just as I was. In my class, there were no women at HUC. Sally was 2 years before me. She was ordained. There were no women in my class. There was one woman in the class after me. And then we began seeing the results of these women. Now, all of that began to develop all kinds of changes because women brought their perspective, their unique perspective, their way of thinking, and their experiences, what they had gone through. So the Seders began to change. It's why we had feminist Seders, women's Seders. You all probably have been to a number of them, right? Alice knows Debbie Friedman ran a number of them early on. And we had them at Temple, especially after Rabbi Pomerantz came.
I have my own.
Well, I'm saying, but Rabbi Pomerantz was the first female rabbi in South Florida. And she came as a part-timer originally, right? That's how she came to us. So you think about it, this has all been very, very new. And women in the story of the Seder is also new, right? In the Haggadah, women do not appear in the traditional Haggadah. You use Maxwell House, some of you. We used it as well. It was free. Why wouldn't you use it? You went to the supermarket. Maxwell House wanted you to buy their products. So they gave you these cheap little Haggadahs. We had them as well. You could take as many as you needed. If you had a Seder for 30, you could take 30 Haggadot. You didn't have to buy and invest in all of this stuff, right? So you bought matzah, right? And Manischewitz also produced at a certain point their Haggadot, and they advertised. There was advertising in those Haggadot, right? And you took it home, and you didn't care that it got stained or it got beat up. You put it in a box, and you took it out again next year. And if you needed a few more, next year there were some more. For many years, they produced them. Now, the front was in Hebrew. One side was in Hebrew, right to left. Left to right was in English, right? But it also had transliteration for parts. So it grew over time. All of that, these were changes that were going on. And women started saying, I don't want to be in the kitchen. And we started hearing from women rabbis, women educators, eventually women cantors. They came later. Originally, women were, song leaders, choir leaders, musical parts of the service, but eventually they became actually formally, they were invested, they were not ordained. The ordination of cantors is very recent. That only took place in the last 10 years. They called them invested. But women started all different roles within the synagogue, including becoming presidents. Remember, Alice, who was our first president, female president? Helen Kotler. It wasn't that long ago. It was after I came. So we had not had, in the whole history before I came, there wasn't a woman president of the synagogue. The women who were on the board when I came were by and large the wives of or the sisterhood representatives. They were not, the executive committee was all men, and men ran the synagogue. And that was typical of synagogues around the entire Jewish world. So all of these changes have taken place because we've had women's voices. Now, those voices also began to reinterpret the Seders and start to focus on the women in the story. Remember, the Haggadah, as it evolved, was only about God. It wasn't about Moses, wasn't about Aaron, wasn't about Joshua. It was about God. The story of the Haggadah is all God-directed. The human beings play a very, very insignificant role in a traditional Haggadah. There's hardly a mention of any of them. There's mention of the children of Israel, Bnei Israel, and Pharaoh, and the plagues, right? But it's basically about God. But one of the things that started to happen with women's voices was to begin to reclaim the human beings in the story. I don't want to say that women are more sensitive to human beings than men.
But they are.
Why? Why not?
But women hear the stories in a different way than men hear the stories. And women saw the story of the Jewish people as a more human story in many ways. And that also resonated during the 20th century with the hearing of minority stories, different people's stories. That was evolving during that century. So the Midrash we're going to look at from Dirshuni, and Dirshuni is really a kind of an accumulation of all of these events that brings us into the 21st century. Now we have classes of rabbis that are, majority of them are women. Most synagogues in the liberal world, and even in the Orthodox world, have experienced women presidents, women on the board, women educators. Even within the Orthodox world, they have ordained women in the left wing of the Orthodox movement.
Oh,
Really?
They're not called, in most cases, they're not called rabbis. They're called rabbah, or they have a number of names that they're playing with, but women have been ordained. In Israel, women in the Orthodox world in Israel have been made as representatives of women in the Jewish Beit Din courts, the Orthodox Beit Dins. Women, all of this is slow in the Orthodox world, but it was slow in our world, in the liberal world too, right? Until the kind of the wheel started in motion very slowly and has picked up speed. But it's all been in our lifetime. I just want to point that out to you, that we have experienced this cataclysmic tectonic change in Jewish life and in Western life. Hasn't existed right now in the Muslim world. the Islamic world, unfortunately, was more enlightened in the 10th century, the 9th century, than it is today. It is moving again, but it very slowly and only in certain areas, certain pockets, but it is moving. But in the 9th century, 10th century, even 11th century, women were very much a part of the Islamic establishment, Islamic world. Muhammad's wife was one of the major figures of Muhammad's life and the life of early Islam. Muhammad's daughter was very involved. So women were very much there. In Christianity, not so. Christianity, the women were secondary characters. It was the apostles and Jesus. His mother played a role. Mary Magdalena played a role. There were women in the story, but they played secondary roles, right? So Christianity developed as a male-oriented entity, largely. Islam had a more balanced view for quite a while, and then veered toward male dominance and has been male dominated for a long time. And Judaism was also there until we got toward the modern era. But we have been experiencing these women's voices now for half a century, and they have affected our prayer services. They have affected our literature. They've affected our leadership and the way we think about being Jewish, and they're affecting every aspect of our tradition. So I chose a text that I want to share with you. I sent it out. I think Noemi sent it out. So let me share it. Yes, Alice?
Yeah, just the one point, it seems that Israel doesn't give women enough credit. Apparently, before October 7th, they had all the women as scouts, and they reported that there was something brewing, there was going to be a war, and called it into headquarters, and they ignored it
You're talking about
because they were women. And they all said, if this had been men, the war would have been averted.
So you're talking about the IDF, the establishment of the IDF. It's still true. Women actually play very important roles, but they are also not in the higher echelons of the IDF and the decision-making. It's true if you look at their war cabinet, it's all men. Even though there are many women in the Knesset and even in the government, they're not in the war cabinet. War is still seen, I would say, almost universally as men's work in the world. There are very few women. In fact, you all probably saw the movie Golda. And you saw that Golda, one of the things about Golda is she didn't have any military experience. And for a while, even there, in the early days of the Yom Kippur War and before it, leading up to it, they discounted her. And then ultimately she had to make all of the major decisions. She relied heavily on the men in her cabinet and was in some ways, they let her down. Moshe Dayan, you remember, he had a mental breakdown early on in the war. The head of security would not own up to the mistakes that he made, which would have averted the war as well. The early warnings devices they had in Egypt that he didn't have turned on. He never admitted to those mistakes. So the world of war is still seen as men's work. I think that will change. One of the things we've seen in this war in Israel is that women have proven themselves as frontline combat soldiers. They are in Gaza. They have been in Gaza from day one. They were heroic in defending a number of the kibbutzim and moshavim on the front lines on October 7th through the early days of that war. They've been driving the tanks into Gaza. So there's a lot of changes going on, but war, I hope that women will not embrace war as a place for them to be heard, but their voices will be more listened to. But you're right, women's voices are still discounted in many places. So let's look at this text. And I would argue that what this text is about, Ayala Ronen Samuels is an Israeli. I think what she's trying to do is write a text for a modern Haggadah, and not just a way of us writing a creative text, but she's trying to write it in a traditional way, a way that the Haggadah itself, when it was formulated by men, would have accepted this text as a legitimate text, not just a creative writing exercise, which tends to be the way we have added texts into the modern women's Haggadahs. We creatively write them. She's writing it in a traditional way. So what does that mean? She finds a text in Deuteronomy. You can all see it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. So she finds this text in Deuteronomy, and she sees in the text that it says, "V'yotzianu Adonai miMitzrayim." That should echo with the Haggadah, right? Ilu hotzianu miMitzrayim. Right? Okay. Well, that's where this comes. That's where that song comes from. V'yotzianu Adonai miMitzrayim. Right? So the writer took that phrase, made it into a singable way, and did Yotzianu v'hotzianu miMitzrayim dayenu. Okay, and then made it into a refrain. So she looks at this text in Deuteronomy, V'yotzianu Adonai miMitzrayim, and then she notices something. How does God take us out of Egypt? And God took us out of Egypt, biyad chazakah, with a mighty hand, bizroa netuyah, by an outstretched arm, b'morah gadol, with awesome power, uva otot uva motim, and by signs and portents. 4 different ways God yotzianu miMitzrayim, took us out of Egypt, right? 4 different ways. So why is that significant for the Haggadah?
4 questions.
Okay, 4 questions.
4 cups,
4 cups of wine, right?
4 sons.
4 sons, 4 children.
4 mothers of Israel.
We eventually, right? 4 mothers of Israel, which we added later. But there's a pattern in the Haggadah that we believe comes out of the Greek society feast, symposium, they were, salons, where everything had to be in 4s. Everything was in 4s. It's not the way we organize. We tend to organize in 3s in Western world, because we come out of a Christian tradition, right? Father, Son, Holy Spirit, right? So we come out of a Western society. We do 3s and 10s. We like 10s because you could argue the 10 Commandments, but 10 is also a very important number in not just Jewish tradition, but in Western society. It feels like a whole number, but 4 doesn't quite feel whole in Western society, but it did in the Greek society, and it did in the Roman society. So when the Haggadah was written, it evolved in that tradition, right? So she finds, if we go back to her again, we go back, we see, she finds these 4 with V'yotzianu miMitzrayim. So she wants to say, how did God take us out with a mighty hand? How did God take us out with an outstretched arm? How did God take us out with awesome power and by signs and portents? So that's the Hebrew. I'll take us to the English. All right. Bubbie, you get to read first. You're up. Are you muted? I think you're muted, Bob.
This will work better. Okay. The Holy One, blessed be he, only took us out of Egypt in the merit of the wise-hearted women by a mighty hand, that is, the daughter of Levi, who strengthened her hand to send her son into the water, as it is stated. So she got a wicker basket for him and caulked it with bitumen and pitch, and she put the child into it and placed it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile.
All right, so let's start there. That's the first. That's by a mighty hand. So what do you see in what she's describing there, in the person she's describing? First of all, who is she describing?
Moses.
Is she describing Moses?
Oh, Miriam.
Is
Well,
she describing Miriam?
Pharaoh's
No,
daughter.
Pharaoh's daughter.
Pharaoh's daughter, is she? Who's the daughter of Levi?
Oh,
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 who's Levi?
Rabbit.
Yocheved, Joni got it. Okay, Yocheved, Moses' mother, right?
Oh, okay.
That's the daughter of Levi. It says if you look in Exodus, and the son and a Levite took a Levite woman, and they had a child, right? So it doesn't give their names there. We don't learn their names until later, and obviously we forgot their names there for a minute, some of us. So Yocheved, the daughter of Levi, by a mighty hand. Why by a mighty hand? Why does she identify the writer of this with the daughter of Levi, with Yocheved? What about her hand? She strengthened her hand to what? Think about her. What did she do?
She put together the basket and caulked it and everything,
Yes.
which is manual labor.
Yes, think about it. Think about what was going on in Egypt. That's what Midrash wants us to do. Wants us to picture what was going on. It's not just a story. It's about Pharaoh decrees that all sons will be cast into the Nile. What did it look like to everyone in Goshen, to the Jews in Goshen? What was going on in the Nile? Babies,
Murder.
dead babies were floating by, right? Dead babies, dead Jewish babies are floating by. This didn't just happen in one day. They wanted to wipe out all these boys for a period of time. Soldiers were going home to home, listening for babies' cries, checking to see if they were think of the Nazis hunting for Jews. Thinking about looking for these babies, to hear them, to go in to see, is it a boy? If it's a boy, taking them out, either slitting their throats and throwing them in the Nile, or just throwing them in, the way the Nazis threw in babies into the furnace. You got to think, she wants you, right? Midrash wants us to imagine real life. This was not just a story. This was terror. This was October 7th, right? This was decapitating babies. That's what was going on. So in the midst of this pregnant Levite woman, Yocheved, is desperate to not have a boy. She's hoping to have another girl, right? She had already Aaron, she had Miriam, and she's pregnant at this terrible time. God should be good to her and give her a girl. And so she shouldn't see the death of her little boy, her baby. But she births a baby boy. And miracle of miracles, this boy doesn't seem to cry out very much. Had to be a pretty quiet baby, right? In order to escape the notice of the Pharaoh's soldiers who were looking for baby boys, had to be somehow quiet. Some babies are quieter than others. Moses was quiet. The midrash that the men wrote was that Moses had a light shining from him. Well, why would you imagine a light when you're trying to hide a baby? Right? They imagined he glowed. He was some kind of special child. But Ayala recognizes this wasn't a glow. This was a child that somehow she was able to keep quiet. She nursed this baby. She was keeping him as quiet as possible for about 3 months. And then it was getting beyond her. She recognized she couldn't keep hiding him. So what did she do? Well, let's imagine. What did she do? Either some other Jewish women had already come up with the idea of putting baskets in the Nile. Maybe she saw a basket in the Nile with a baby. Maybe someone else, an unknown woman, had created already this model. Maybe not. Maybe Yocheved figured it out herself. And she thought, maybe I can somehow give my child a chance, my little boy. What can I do? Well, I'm going to take my hands and I'm going to form this basket, make it waterproof, put my baby in it, and send it down the Nile. She's using her hands and her mind to create this possibility that Moshe will survive. You see that picture?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Alice. What?
Was Moses circumcised at that point?
Well, that's a question, of course. And the answer would be, depending on who writes it, yes, he was circumcised. We don't know if he was circumcised at that point or if it happens later. Remember, we haven't gotten to that part of the story. We will, but Yocheved is going to be the wet nurse that will raise him for 3 years. So it might have been that they waited until later. We don't know. It doesn't tell us in the story. It's possible. But now you're asking the kind of questions that Midrash wants you to ask. What was really happening in their life? How did they suffer through this terrible time and still remain committed as Jews, or as Hebrews at that time, Israelites, to their tradition? Shall we go on with the Midrash? Okay.
Yeah.
Let's look at
Yes.
next. Yeah. Okay. Oh, that's the wrong one. I have to go back. I picked up the wrong one. It's this one. Okay. Oh, no, I keep picking up the wrong one. Why is that? You see, I'm not as skilled at this as I should be at this stage. Women's study, Dershuni, there you are. Okay, here we are. All right, so we did the first one, a mighty hand. Now the second one, she's going to do it shorter, but who's up for reading this little one? Alice, you want to do this?
Sure. By an outstretched arm, as it is stated, she spied the basket among the reeds and sent out her arm to fetch it.
Okay, look at it. Outstretched arm, sent out her arm to fetch it. That's in the text, right? Who is it that stretched out her arm?
You have it?
No,
That's Pharaoh's daughter.
that's
Or-
Batya, Pharaoh's daughter. We don't know her name. Later we find her name as Batya, which means, as the cantor knows, daughter of God.
Oops,
Who is her father?
oh God.
Who is her father?
Pharaoh.
Pharaoh. Is Pharaoh a human being in the Egyptians' eyes? No, he's a god, right? She is the daughter of Pharaoh, the daughter of God, in Egyptians' eyes. Now, that could have been a translation of her name into Hebrew. Could have been. Or it could have been they gave her that name because she was considered that in Egyptian society. But it is Batya. It is the daughter of Pharaoh, who is bathing by the river in the Nile, obviously in a quiet area with no crocodiles. They wouldn't let Pharaoh's daughter get into a danger. They probably created this nice bath area off to the side of the Nile by the reeds. They probably blocked it off and had ways of keeping like any dangerous things out of there, right? And she was there bathing in the Nile's waters. And you have to imagine that this was something she did daily or weekly, a regular bathing opportunity for her. She then would have oils on her body and perfumes, right? She's Pharaoh, she's a princess. Imagine her. And she's there in her regular kind of activity in the spa. She's at the spa, right? That's where she is. She's in the Egyptian Nile spa. And what does she see? She sees a basket.
Basket floating.
She hears a cry. Now, apparently, she has no children. She may be already infertile. It may be because she certainly, as a woman, would have wanted to bear children in those days, would have wanted to give her father a child, particularly a son. And she has no children as far as we know, right? Text doesn't. She hears a baby's cry. She stretches her arm to the basket. She doesn't send her handmaiden to get it. She herself goes to get the basket. She sees a baby. She embraces the baby in her arms. And she decides, this is mine. I will raise this child as my own child. Right? Now there's a big step going on for the daughter of Pharaoh, because she certainly knew that Pharaoh had made a decree about Hebrew babies. Why was this baby in the Nile? Would an Egyptian mother have done that? Maybe. Maybe she could have fooled herself into thinking that. Maybe. Maybe she suspected, was he circumcised, Alice? Maybe she looked and realized he was circumcised. It's a baby boy in the Nile. It's got to be a Hebrew. My father has decreed they should die. But whatever it is, she embraces this child in her arms. That's the mighty arm. Outstretched arm, mighty hand. Outstretched arm, mighty hand. Yocheved and Batya, right? Let's go back to our text and see who the next one is. Oh, okay. Who, you're still reading, Alice?
And fearful power, that is Shifra and Puah. As it is stated, the midwives, fearing God, did not do as the king of Egypt had told them. They let the boys live.
All right, wait, look, take a look. Fearful power, fearing God. That's the same root. It's the same root. She takes fearful power and fearing God, and she says that's Shifra and Puah. Right now we're going back to why the boys weren't killed earlier, why we even got to this stage. Shifra and Puah worked their defiance of Pharaoh, right? Because of their fear of God, because they respected God more than Pharaoh. They put their own lives at stake. They knew they were defying Pharaoh. These are all women, right? V'yotzianu Adonai miMitzrayim. And God took us out of Egypt. How? By Yocheved, by Batya, by Shifra and Puah. And let's look at the final one. And that is, I'm getting better at this. Okay. And signs and portents, that is Miriam. Since all the years that the Israelites wandered in the desert, a wondrous well that was given to them on her account rolled together with them until the day that she died, and the well went away, as it is stated. And the people stayed at Kadesh. Miriam died there and was buried there, and the community was without water. Okay, why? Because it is signs and portents. And she's saying Miriam's sign that she brought us out was this well of fresh water that was given because of Miriam. But I want to show you something about Miriam. When Batya stretches out her hand, when Yocheved puts the basket in the water, who is the connecting person?
Miriam.
Miriam. Yocheved says to Miriam, her daughter, go follow the basket. Why does Yocheved look to Miriam? What about Miriam makes her trust Miriam to do this? She's a young girl. Let's
Maybe,
imagine.
maybe because she's young, she can handle it more better.
Okay, maybe she also has already shown characteristics of being the Miriam we know, bold, right? Forceful, dominant, a prophetess.
Comfortable in the water.
Comfortable in the water, right? Now that really is interesting. Why does Batya listen to Miriam? Here's this Hebrew pisher, Miriam, talking to Pharaoh's daughter at the baths and says, have I got a wet nurse for you? Right? It's Miriam that says to Pharaoh's daughter, what chutzpah? This little girl, this little Hebrew girl is talking to Pharaoh's daughter and saying, I got a wet nurse who can take care of that baby for you until it's already weaned. Why would you imagine that Batya would listen to Miriam? Now, think this is the way I think it is. I think that Batya employed slaves around the baths. I think Miriam was one of those slaves. I think Miriam served, along with other Jewish girls, served Pharaoh's daughters at the baths, and Miriam was known to Yocheved, to Batya. Miriam was familiar. She knew her. She had had conversations with her. Miriam was sent by Yocheved because Miriam could get that basket to Pharaoh's daughter, because she was familiar with the pattern of Yocheved, of Batya, of the way she bathed, of the tides of the Nile, of how the water flowed. She could sneak that basket in, and she could then approach Pharaoh's daughter and say, I have the wet nurse for you. And the daughter of Pharaoh would listen to this little Hebrew pisher because she liked her, because she had a relationship with her. All of this was because she worked in the baths. And
But why didn't she do it herself? Why didn't Batya do it herself?
Why didn't Batya do what?
She couldn't.
How could she breastfeed this baby?
She be
When she hadn't given any birth.
Right.
She wouldn't have any
She
milk.
had no milk, but
Okay.
she would have anyway, as Pharaoh's daughter. By and large, what they did in high society, they didn't want to damage their breasts and the way
Right, so
they looked, and they would have a wet nurse to take care of it, and they would
Right.
suppress their milk. That's still done in many levels of society and has been done for centuries. So yeah, she would look for a wet nurse. And of course, she would trust this little girl that she knew. Why else would she trust her? Why would she listen to her?
Had to be.
So all of this takes us into the real story. And who does God use to deliver the Jewish people from Egypt? The four elements that are all women who God uses to take us out. And I'm saying that I think Ayala, who wrote this, is saying to us, here's a new text that fits right in the Haggadah with four different levels, just like we have in the Haggadah. Here we now have these four levels of women who took us out of the land of Egypt, actually, that God took us out of the land of Egypt by their means. What do you think?
makes
It's a
sense.
plausible
It's a great-
story.
Makes sense to me.
I don't understand. Did she keep taking the baby, having the wet nurse, having it feed her, and then she would bring it back to Pharaoh's daughter?
Well, that's the midrash you can write, Alice. Yes, we know that he weaned at 3 years, which was the tradition in biblical days, apparently 3 years old, they weaned the babies off the breasts. Did she visit? Did they come back and forth? Did Batya have a relationship with Yocheved? Did they get to know each other through Miriam? Was it kind of an extended
Yes.
family of slaves? You know, like house slaves? Did Yocheved work? She was, after all, a Levite. Did she work in the house of Pharaoh with Batya? You can now imagine a whole story of the family, the women, working together with Batya in order to raise up this boy as a prince of Egypt. And then we can talk about, what did Moses think of the wet nurse? And did he lose touch with her? Did he have a relationship with her? Was she a part of his life, but he never knew she was his biological mother? Did he know that Miriam was his sister, or did he not? At what point does he find that out? We don't see that in the Tanakh, in the Torah. But all of these are moments that bring it alive. Okay. Well, it was wonderful being with you this evening. And next week, we will look at the Gaza text, and I'll probably bring you another Dear Shuni text. All right?
Okay,
Hey,
thank
Wonderful
you.
evening. You're welcome.
Thank you. Good night, Joni, wherever you are.
Good, I'm here.
Good night, everyone.
Good
Good
night.